On December 22, 1989, a white Dolphin helicopter lands on the roof of the Communist Party Central Committee HQ in Bucharest. Its blades keep spinning because it needs to take off right away. And just then, a group of people comes up to the roof. It's the Romanian dictator Ceausescu with his wife Elena, a couple of party officials and bodyguards. Down below, the crowd is going wild. People are storming the building trying to catch the dictator. Ceausescu and his wife are pale. They can barely walk. They're basically carried into the helicopter, and it manages to take off at the last second, just before the protesters finally reach the roof. And no one yet knows what's going to happen to Ceausescu just a few hours later. A little coffee, and we'll keep going. Just an unobtrusive reminder to do that thing under the video in case you forget. So the helicopter. It was flown by Ceausescu's personal pilot, Vasile Milutin. That morning, he and two other crew members were ordered to take off from Bucharest Airport and land on the roof of the Communist Party Central Committee headquarters. That's right in the city center. They followed the order but had no idea what was going on until they approached the square and saw a crowd pouring into the building. The helicopter landed and Ceausescu was pushed along, practically carried by his bodyguards. The dictator and his wife were also accompanied by two party loyalists, but that was already too much for one helicopter. In the end, the mechanic literally had to sit on Ceausescu's lap, and only then did the helicopter lift off. The dictator ordered the pilot to fly to Snagov, a town 20 miles north of Bucharest, where Ceausescu had a summer residence. After arriving there, Ceausescu demanded two more helicopters with soldiers for armed protection, but Milutin's unit commander refused to follow the orders over the phone. He announced that a revolution had taken place in the country and that Ceausescu and everyone with him were on their own now. Plans had to change, and the dictator ordered them to head to Titu, or, according to other reports, to Boteni. But this time, the overloaded helicopter couldn't take off. It was only built for 4 passengers. 2 party loyalists had to be left behind in Snagov, and only then did the helicopter lift off and head west. One of Ceausescu's bodyguards ordered radio silence and, according to the pilot, pointed a machine gun at him, but the pilot didn't obey. And a few minutes later, a message came through the radio saying the government had been overthrown and any aircraft spotted in the sky would be treated as a military target. According to the pilot's account, Ceausescu didn't believe a coup had taken place. He said, "No, these are only horrible lies. Aren't you loyal to the cause?" Only the threat of being shot down scared the dictator, and he gave the order to land. It happened on a road not far from their destination. When Ceausescu got out of the helicopter, he asked the pilot again, "Are you not serving the cause?" And the pilot replied, "Which cause should I serve?" Ceausescu apparently didn't answer. Once on the ground, the toppled dictator, his wife Elena, and 2 bodyguards stopped a passing car, ordered the 4 passengers out, and drove off. Basically, they just hijacked the car with the driver still in it. At 1:22 p.m. local time, the country's radio started broadcasting a message. "Attention, Nicolae Ceausescu is trying right now to flee to Titu Airport. Citizens of Argus County, Romanian Army, try to catch the tyrant. Surround the airport. He must be judged according to the laws of the country, the laws of humanity. Intercept the plane. Don't forget, dear friends, don't forget that justice exists and justice will prevail. We fear that Nicolae and his family will escape our retribution." And here it's worth mentioning that the car Ceausescu stopped belonged to Nicolae Petrisor, a regular guy who fixed bikes for a living. Petrisor recognized his passengers right away and managed to convince them he knew a safe place. The best option, he said, was to hide in the Agricultural Institute on the edge of town, and Ceausescu agreed. When they arrived, the dictator of the institute led the Ceausescus into a room and then locked them in. Soon the local police showed up, arrested the couple, and after some back and forth, moved them to the military garrison camp in Târgoviște. At 14:38, the radio started broadcasting. "We do not know how true this information is, but if it is true, this is a great victory for the people. Nicolae Ceausescu and Elena Ceausescu have been caught. They are in Târgoviște. They have been arrested. The dictator's fate was sealed." To get Ceausescu to Târgoviște, they put him in an armored vehicle. Both spouses were pale and clearly under a lot of stress. Still, for a while, they managed to stay calm. They spent a few days in captivity while Romania's new authorities figured out what to do with them. Some wanted a quick execution, others insisted on at least some kind of formal hearing. In the end, the interim president backed the idea of a trial. And so, on December 25th in Târgoviște, an emergency military tribunal was convened, led by 10 military judges. Ceausescu could have shared the fate of other Eastern European communist leaders in 1989, resignation and a disgraceful retirement. But for that, he simply needed to stick to the socialist ideals that hadn't helped the country thrive. However, the dictator went way beyond failed ideas, and it was his attitude toward the country and the people that led to disastrous consequences. Here's the list of charges they brought against Ceausescu and his wife. First, genocide, over 60,000 victims. Second, ruining the national economy. Third, undermining state power by organizing armed actions against the people. Fourth, crimes related to destroying public property through demolishing and damaging buildings, bombings in cities, and so on. And finally, fifth, trying to flee the country using more than $1 billion kept in foreign banks. All these charges sounded pretty serious. And to understand where they came from, you need to take a closer look at Nicolae Ceausescu himself. He was the second and last communist leader of Romania, holding the position of General Secretary of the Romanian Communist Party from 1965 to 1989, so 25 years. That's a really long time. But it's not just about the time he spent in power. Ceausescu's rule quickly turned totalitarian and became known as the most repressive in the Eastern Bloc. Just take his secret police, the Securitate, which was basically both an intelligence agency and political detective service at the same time. The Securitate was in charge of mass surveillance as well as major repression and human rights abuses in the country. All the media and any press were under its control. By 1985, at the peak of the Securitate's power, there were about 11,000 agents and 500,000 informants working for them. At the same time, life in Romania had gotten especially tough by the late 1980s. Around then, Ceausescu was trying to pay off the country's huge foreign debts. Food, heating, and electricity were rationed, and any dissent was crushed. Actually, pretty much everything Ceausescu thought was bad for his regime got shut down. Malnutrition had become common, and Romania had the highest child mortality rate in Europe. The tough economic cuts led to frequent power outages, fuel shortages, and rising poverty. Lines for household goods became a daily thing, and this naturally sparked discontent across the country. The frustration only grew because huge amounts of money were poured into pointless demolition and rebuilding of cities. Honestly, running massive construction projects while your people are starving isn't the smartest move. But when it comes to the triggers of the revolution, historians point to Ceausescu's fateful political speech after the protests in Timișoara, the brutal crackdown on another protest, and the ignoring of the growing public anger. And here maybe it makes sense to explain more, because these were the events that actually caused him to flee. Nicolae Ceausescu came back from a government visit to Iran and was planning to give a public speech to the people on December 21st. It was supposed to happen from the building of the Central Committee of the Communist Party. This was where most important decisions were made, and from there Ceausescu and his close circle ran the country. Basically, it was kind of a symbol of power, plus the building had a richly decorated balcony above the main entrance. From that balcony, there was a view of a huge open square that could hold tens of thousands of people. So basically, a perfect spot for a public address. Right here, Ceausescu gave most of his political speeches, which sometimes went on for hours. Ordinary Romanians, mostly government workers and some union workers, were usually brought to the square by bus. Then small party officials would take charge, shouting slogans and telling people when to sing. And so on December 21st, 1989, a huge crowd was gathered in the square. At that moment, nobody knew that Nicolae Ceausescu was only a few hours away from falling. There are no exact figures, but it's known that about 100,000 people gathered in the square. People brought red flags and huge portraits of the dictator with them. They were handed out beforehand, and during the speech, they played a recording of enthusiastic cheers to make it seem like Ceausescu had support. And the crowd would cheer him on every time, but not this day. Just 2 minutes into his speech, whistles, mocking laughter, and shouts of Timișoara broke out, the very city whose protests sparked people across the country. Ceausescu raised his hand to silence the shouting. The stunned look on his face when the booing didn't stop was the exact moment his regime started falling apart right before their eyes. And Ceausescu himself realized it too. Witnesses later recalled that at first they couldn't believe the confusion, but then it sparked a huge stir. After all, Ceausescu was the guy who had controlled every part of their lives for as long as they could remember. And now here he was standing in front of them, not knowing what to do. By the way, Ceausescu's speech was broadcast all over the country in an attempt to show that he still had control over the country, but his confusion and the angry shouting of the people had the opposite effect. For a while, the dictator and his wife stayed on the balcony, even trying to reach out to the crowd. In particular, Ceausescu announced a small raise in pensions and salaries, but after that, the bodyguards still took the couple inside, and just in time, because the angry people started pouring into the streets. As the hours went by, more and more people showed up. The protesters weren't armed and were demanding the dictator step down, but Ceausescu didn't try to calm them down or make any compromise. Instead, he sent in the military, tanks, armored personnel carriers, anti-terror units, and undercover Securitate agents. Soon, they started shooting at the crowd from all sides. I won't go into details, but I'll just say the number of casualties was so high that at night they had to send street washing machines out to wash the blood off the streets. Most likely, early in the morning on December 22nd, the Ceausescus made their second mistake. Instead of fleeing the city under the cover of night, they decided to wait for morning. Apparently, they thought the attempts to crush the protests had succeeded and there was nothing left to be afraid of. However, by 7 a.m., Elena Ceausescu got the news that huge columns of workers from many factories were heading to the center of Bucharest to join the protests. The police switched sides, but even that didn't make the dictator back down. He was planning to address the people again, and helicopters dropped leaflets urging protesters to go back home and enjoy the upcoming Christmas feast. That was a terrible decision since many people were starving and couldn't even get basic stuff like cooking oil, let alone throw a feast. The military soon began to join the protesters amid confusion in the defense ministry. It was linked to the mysterious death of the former minister. Ordinary soldiers thought he had been killed on Ceausescu's orders. Commanders did not defend the dictator, and this ended any chance of Ceausescu remaining in power. And as protesters approached, he escaped with his wife in that very helicopter just seconds before his pursuers reached the roof. It's interesting that according to some reports, Ceausescu had two escape routes. The first was by helicopter, which he used, but there was still a second one, the bunker. The bunker was 3 levels below the basement of the Central Committee building and was strong enough to withstand a nuclear attack. It had food and other supplies, a control center, an air purifier, and access to tunnels throughout the city. Through those tunnels, Ceausescu could reach his home, Spring Palace, and from there to Lake Hurastrau, where a boat was permanently parked ready to get him to a car, and that car to the airfield. In addition to all this, the maze of tunnels led to a huge number of safe houses used by police forces loyal to Nicolae Ceausescu. The entrances to some of them were hidden in cemetery crypts. The tunnels also connected 2 airports, the headquarters of the Communist Party and Ceausescu's palace in the center of Bucharest. Also in these tunnels were stockpiles of weapons. Perhaps the dictator wanted to use one of these underground passages, especially since some were clearly created specifically for his escape, but something went wrong. His plans were thwarted by the army and some representatives of the Securitate. According to another theory, the couple decided that this way was not reliable enough because the architects who built the tunnels could reveal their location. And they did indeed do so, which means that both the bunker and the underground passages were not safe for the dictator on the run. However, as we already know, the helicopter didn't work either. Let's move to December 25th, the day when the show trial was hastily organized. It did indeed turn out to be a show trial, and a very quick one at that. The hastily appointed defense attorney, Nicu Teodorescu, insisted that Ceausescu plead insanity as the only way to avoid the death penalty. But they believed too much in their own importance to resort to such tricks. Perhaps they didn't believe how grave the danger they faced. Whatever the case, the trial lasted 2 hours. The charges were brought. And while they were being read out, Nicolae smiled, laughed, and shook his head. No factual evidence was presented, but there was no need for it. All the judges already knew how the trial would end. The couple had no opportunity to justify themselves, defend themselves, or appeal. And although throughout the trial Ceausescu refused to recognize the legitimacy of the court, that didn't matter either. By the way, when reading the transcript or watching the video, it's clear that Elena was the first to learn of the verdict, but the verdict was the same. The court sentenced both spouses to death. Immediately after the verdict, Nicolae tried to challenge the decision but was denied. Elena was silent and looked confused. Before he was led out of the room, the dictator turned to a soldier and said that he wished to be executed next to his wife. This request was granted, although the sentence ordered otherwise. Then it all went even faster. The soldier returned with a rope to tie both Ceausescu's hands, but they both resisted, shouting and arguing, saying that it was not necessary. Now, however, no one listened to them, and their hands were tied, and then they were taken outside. Nicolae continued to challenge the legitimacy of the trial, even when Eleanor realized that it was futile. "We're powerless now," she told her husband at the end. It's said that Eleanor also insulted the firing squad, but according to other rumors, she began to cry. According to others, she told them off. Nicolae, on the other hand, remained calm until the very end and began to sing the first lines of the Internationale, the International Proletarian Anthem. The firing squad started shooting as soon as they were both against the wall. The execution happened too quickly for the television crew to film it in its entirety. However, footage of the trial and its outcome was still published in many Western countries 2 days after the execution. They appeared on Romanian television the same evening. What happened caused a strong public outcry, and several countries criticized the new rulers of Romania after the execution because of the lack of a public trial. Thus ended the life of Romanian dictator Nicolae Ceausescu and his failed escape. You owe me a like. See you later.